Thank you for inviting me to present for this fall event for the Badgeland user group. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a business development manager for TriStar. Have been working with TriStar for about 13 years now. Prior to that, I was with PTC Direct for 16 years and have been using PTC products since the early 90s. And maybe a little bit before that, to be honest, but primarily focusing on PTC products since about 1990, 91, that time frame there. I went to work for PTC in 1995 and then went to TriStar, like I said, about 13 years ago. And so my focus is really on CAD products. And one of the things that I do for customers is I help them improve their design process through the use of Creo and improving their processes and their techniques and so on. So I want to go a little bit back in time though and do a little kind of a evolution of product development in CAD for you, so you can kind of understand where we've been and where we're going. If you think about where product development started, it probably started with the pyramids, maybe even before, where we were creating drawings. But if you go back to the 15th century and you think about Leonardo da Vinci, he was, really a genius as far as coming up with different, designs and products and mechanisms and machines and so on. And so he did a good job of documenting his products, of course, or his ideas anyway, and he did that by hand and drawings like you see here. But by the time we got into the later 19th century and early 20th century and even into the later 20th century, we were doing pretty much the same thing, product development, but we had some fairly sophisticated tools to do that with. And I'm sure many of the people in the audience today have actually been in this type of a drafting room, if you will, and this is how things were set up. And this is kind of where I got my start as well. I was actually a board drafter back in the early 80s and working out in China Lake, California, doing product development for naval airborne weapons systems. And so out in the desert, we were creating these kind of drawings, by hand on a drawing board. And they were, certainly including all of our GD&T that we see today, but, they were done by hand. And if we had to make any changes, we had to go in and, modify the drawing. And of course, that was a lot of work to do that kind of stuff. But by the time we got into the 80s, we were using kind of a mainframe CAD system to do our product development and our documentation. And this is where I got my start in CAD as well, out in China Lake, California. Again, doing support for airborne naval weapons systems. And so, China Lake, California is probably one of the largest naval bases in the world. However, it has no water. So it's in the middle of the desert, but they use this to test their weapon systems. And so it was exciting to live out there, and that we always saw a lot of aerial type activity, different fighter jets flying over, different weapons being tested and so on. And, every couple of years, the Blue Angels would come into town and you could watch the Blue Angels practice in the airspace. So it's kind of an exciting place to live in that regards. But, how we did our work every day was, we were working on a mainframe CAD system. This is actually an example of computer vision CADs 4. And with this, we had a monitor that was connected to the desk. The desk had a cabinet on the side that housed the motherboard for the computer. And we didn't have a mouse. We had a digitizing pen that had a couple buttons on it that we would use to, select and press our menu buttons and things like that. We didn't have a modern menu like you see today, where it's on the screen and, a dashboard above the graphics area. This is really what our menu looked like on that little tablet in front. And then at the beginning of the day, we'd come in and fill out some paperwork as to what we wanted to work on for the day. And then we submitted that paperwork to the administrators of the system, and they would load onto our disk drives the data that we wanted to work on. And these disk drives were in another room, connected via cables. And the floor was raised. Some of you have probably been in this situation as well, where in the middle of the desert, in the middle of summer, we're wearing ski jackets in the CAD room because they had to keep it so cold for all the wiring in the floor. But nonetheless, these disk drives is what we were accessing from our computers. And these things were, pretty big around, about the size of an LP, maybe a little bit bigger, and a stack of a dozen or so disks. And these entire disk packs held an astounding amount of memory. I mean, if you think of it back then, 50 megabytes, right? That was what these things held, and they were huge, right? But today, we know 50 megabytes is nothing. That fits on the head of a pin, right? But this is how we performed our work every day. So that disk pack had to be loaded from a tape drive. And so all the data was actually stored on these different tape drives or tapes, if you will. And in the morning when we would fill out that paperwork, that data would get loaded onto the disk drive from the tape drive, and then we would go to work. At the end of the day, the data would be loaded back onto the tapes or transferred back to the tapes. And then these tapes were actually stored in a vault, much like a bank vault, where it had looked like a bank vault in every way, shape, and form. It had a combination on the front, and only certain people had access to that vault. And this is really where the term vault comes from, right? We used to vault our CAD data, and that's what we meant by that. We stored it in the vault. So with all that hardware and capability that we had back then, we were still creating this, a paper-based drawing, a 2D CAD drawing, if you will. And really this drawing, although it looks nice and clean and everything, it wasn't too far removed from this drawing that was done by hand. And if you think back of how long we've been using CAD, for 40 years now, we've really kind of been drawing based. There's a few companies that are moving to model-based definition, but we had those conversations back then, 40 years ago. We were talking about someday we're going to go to model-based definition. Well, with the recent builds of Creo, PTC has really done a great job of enabling capabilities for us to do that, 3D annotated CAD model, which is really the first step down that path of model-based definition. But to get there, we've got to really do a lot better in CAD as far as creating our models, capturing our design intent, so that we can do all of this kind of stuff in the 3D environment. So what we've done at TriStar to help customers get to that point is we've created a series of best practice sessions. Now, these sessions are really focused on best practices more than capabilities and functionality, right? And we try to put these in about a 2-hour time slot. It takes about 90 minutes for the presentation. And thank you for giving me 90 minutes today. But typically we'll go 2 hours and have some time for Q&A. The presentations themselves are just a few slides, just an introduction, a topic preface, and then a list of demonstration focus points. Most, if not all of these, are really focused on best practices with live examples and some minimal customization. In some cases, we can even leverage, customer data for these presentations. Of course, that takes a little bit of development to do that, but we can, tailor these presentations. So currently, we have about 10 presentations available, and I'm always adding more, and I'm always trying to adjust these to fit the latest versions of Creo. However, I try to keep them version agnostic so that anybody using Creo 7 or Creo 8 or Creo 9, whatever, can still use these best practices. So for today, I'm going to present to you the very first in the series, which is dealing with reference selection. And so when we think about the things that we do in Creo, reference selection is probably one of the most important things to understand how Creo works and how to, reference things properly. When we make robust models, we have to think about feature selection first, right? What feature are we going to use to create the model? There's probably several features, but each of those features, we need to select the right feature for that different part of the model. The order of features when we're creating models is important because some features are more prone to failure than others, specifically rounds and so on. We like to typically take do those features in the latter part of the modeling process. The number of features is also important too, because more features creates more opportunity for failure, but fewer features, is more difficult to manage. So there's kind of a balance there in the number of features. I've talked to many users around the world actually, and a lot of them, they're always trying to, I can do this in 3 features, or I can do it in 2 features. Well, that's not always the best approach. You don't want to put too much in any one feature because it becomes difficult to modify when we do that. So, try to, be a little bit thoughtful of what you're putting into any given feature. When we try to make our features more robust, that's where we really get into our reference selection. And we need to know the choice of references that are available to us and the selection methods that are also available to us. And typically, a lot of users don't go very deep into that. They're just picking on something. Maybe if they want to use multiple references, they'll hold their control key down and pick those references. And that's not always the best approach. And that's what we're going to do today, is show you some better ways, right? The number of references is also just as important, because fewer references will always equate to fewer failures in your model, or I should say fewer opportunities for failure. Models fail most commonly because there's a missing reference, right? Creo was looking for something that was used to create a round or whatever the case may be, and it can't find it in the model, and therefore it fails. So we need to understand how Creo uses these references to create features. When we're defining our features, sometimes the features will fail during the definition. And that's just because the elements of the feature cannot be interpreted by Creo. A typical example would be you're trying to add a round to some edge, and the round value is set too large, and Creo just can't build that round, and it'll sit there and spin for a few seconds and then come back with a failure. Well, we know that we can fix that by just editing the value of the round, and then the feature can be created. But that's during the definition of the feature. The least common cause of failures is impossible geometry. Creo cannot create the geometry you're trying to tell it to create. Maybe it's a surface that loops back on itself, creates kind of a bow tie type shape. Creo can't typically build those features. However, I must say that it gets better with each new build. There's things that Creo 4 couldn't create that Creo 10 can. So they're always improving the math behind creating these features to enable more capabilities. So for the demonstration today, we're going to focus a lot on rounds, but don't think of it as just rounds, okay? These techniques can be used for a lot of other features. We're first going to talk about feature ID versus feature number and what's the difference. We'll talk about the choices of reference selection that we have. We'll talk about the methods to select those references. We'll kind of show an example of a datum reference feature. Many of you may have seen the icon for this in the menus, but may have never clicked on it. May have never had a reason to use it. Well, we're going to show you today how to create it and for what circumstance we might use it. I have a couple of configuration settings that I'll share with you that are pretty important to have turned on. And then everything I show you today is pretty much feature independent. These practices can be applied across the board, except for in some cases, sheet metal, they might not work a little bit the same because sheet metal is a little different type of a model. But for solid modeling purposes, these techniques can be applied across the board. And then this is version independent. I'm going to use Creo 10 today, but these things are the same in just about every version of Creo back to version 2001. Okay, so with that, that's my presentation, and I'm going to get started with this very basic model. And this model has an extrusion from the back surface here, the front datum plane, I should say, and has a variable depth option to that surface there. And then just to note, each of these sharp edges were created in the extrude. And I'm using a hidden line here because it's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing for this example. Right, so just to understand how that feature was created. I did use my start template for this model. So I have 4 features already in that template, and they're numbered 1 through 4. And then I created the very first extrude, which is feature number 5. However, its ID is 51. And you'll notice that the IDs will sometimes jump in great numbers. So there's a difference between the feature number and the feature ID. Another thing about feature IDs is Creo will not reuse feature IDs. We can tell it to remap an ID, but Creo will not reuse them by itself. That being said, if I were to take this feature extrude number 1, feature number 5, ID 51, and delete it and then recreate it exactly the same way, it would be extrude number 1 again. It would be feature number 5 again. However, its ID would be something different. The ID is a unique identifier that Creo uses to kind of track these features. So I'll ask a question here. If anybody knows the reason why these feature IDs will jump in such great numbers, sometimes by the hundreds. Does anybody have an idea why that happens? Please feel free to chime in. I like to keep this interactive. You may have to unmute your mic for that. And Deb, I don't know if you need to control that or not.
I think it's about all parameter of the feature.
I'm sorry?
I think the 5 feature ID jumped because inside the extrude number 1, we have a lot of parameter like length and everything. And each...
Yeah, very, very, very close, yes. If you think about this cube, there's a lot of things in this cube that get IDs, right? This cube is made up of 6 surfaces, 12 edges, 8 vertices, and then there's some things that we can't see that all get IDs associated to them. So when we're creating a round, for example, and I select on this edge here, although in my references dialog for the round, it says, well, that's an edge from feature 5, extrude number 1. And if I hold my control key down and I select another edge, what I've done is, it looks like I've selected kind of the same entity. However, these edges have IDs associated to them. And that's what Creo uses when it comes time to regenerate the round. It doesn't know that that's an edge necessarily. It doesn't care that it's an edge. All it cares about is that it has an ID, and it's going to try to build the round on that ID when it finds it. So how do we know that for sure? Well, there's a config option that we got to turn on. So I'm going to cancel this for now, and I'm going to turn on a configuration option. And I'll point out that I am using Creo out of the box with no configs whatsoever. I do not have any config settings that I have here. So I'm going to add one. And this one is a pretty important one, although it's not as important as some others that I'm going to share with you. But this one I want to turn on. It says show selected item ID. Okay. And then its default is set to no. We're going to set that to yes. And when I do that, I can then see the IDs that are assigned to these features or these elements, right? So if I put my cursor on that surface, now we see that it has an ID of 68. That surface has an ID of 66, and so on. All these edges have IDs. Everything that is geometrically based has an ID associated to it. Even in the sketch itself, if we were to edit the definition of the sketch, we can see that the sketched entities also have IDs associated to them. So this is why these, feature IDs will jump in such great numbers, is because of the number of IDs consumed by geometry and other items. Okay,
Can
so it's
you can you
go
highlight that
ahead.
again? Could you
I'm
show
sorry.
that option again, please?
Can I go to the options again?
Yeah, I missed it.
Yeah. So this option is show selected item ID,
Okay, thank you.
and you need to set that to yes. The default is set to no. So unless we turn it on, we can't see this. Okay. So now when I create the round and I select these edges and I'm using my control key, you'll see that I have IDs now being recorded. So that's what Creo cares more about than it cares about the edge. It just cares about the ID. If it can find the ID, then it's going to build the round. So we have ID 69, 71, 65, and 67 being recorded to create this round. Right? So as long as those IDs are in the model, Creo can find them, and then it will try to build the round. If I make a change to this extrusion and I edit the sketch, and I'm going to put some new geometry in here first, right? And then I'm going to delete the stuff I don't want. I'm going to delete this edge here. I'm going to get a warning. And basically, Creo is telling me that this line that I'm deleting in the sketch is actually referenced downstream by other features. Basically, this line creates an ID that's used downstream. And by removing that, I am removing an ID from the model. It's basically kind of telling me that, not in those direct words, but that's what's happening. And so when I do that change, my round fails, okay? As of Creo 3, it really does a good job of showing me not only in the tree what has failed, but if I edit its definition, it shows me, well, there's a problem right there. That red line is missing. And then in my references, it's basically telling me that ID 69 is no longer available. All I have to do is remove that from this list and my round comes back. Okay, but I want to point out something else here, is that ID 208 and 207 were not there before. These are new IDs, and that's this edge here, 208, and this edge here, 207. What Creo did for me was it made an assumption. It made an assumption that there was a round on the edge or the ID that used to be in this position. And since this edge now is created from different geometry, it has to have a new ID. And therefore, Creo makes the assumption that I want the round on those IDs, right? So it highlights those in yellow here in my reference. Now, I can choose whether or not I want to remove them or not. In this case, I want to keep them because that's my intent. Now, this will always stay with this feature. So you can always go back and see that, well, something happened along the way here. Somebody changed something, but my feature still is regenerating properly, and then I can accept that. So just, again, a reminder that Creo will never reuse an ID. If it has a new piece of geometry, it has to give it a new ID. Okay, unless we tell it otherwise, and I'm going to show you in a moment how to do that. But for now, just keep that in mind. We need these IDs for the features to regenerate. If an ID is missing, the feature is going to fail. That's how Creo works. And that's why if you look on disk, why Creo part files are so small is because it's really following a set of instructions on how to build the model. It's really not, the physical 3D geometry or 3D model. It's building the model based on a list of instructions. So the better that you are at writing that list of instructions, the easier it is for Creo to regenerate the model. And in most cases, the model is more robust. So let's take a look at some of the options that we have here. I'm going to just back up through this. And I'm going to create that very same round again, but rather than hold my control key down and pick, I'm going to put my cursor over this edge here, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to use this pick from list. And what you'll notice in the list is everything that's behind my cursor. So certainly that edge was the first thing in front, and then there was that surface and that surface that are all behind my cursor, right? But then there's this thing called an intent edge, and it has an ID of 77, but it is not assigned to any piece of geometry. It's a collector of geometry. And if I pick on that, you'll see that all 4 of those edges have been collected in that intent edge selection. And I can say, okay, there to select all of those at once, and then okay. Now, looking at that round, if I edit the definition, you'll see that we only have one ID being used, right? And since that ID doesn't belong to any piece of geometry, it is a collector, it's really hard for me to remove that. I would have to delete the entire feature for that ID to be removed from the model. So it's more robust in that sense. I can make that very same change that I made a moment ago, right? And in this case, when I delete the pieces I don't want, I don't get that same warning because I am not deleting any ID that's used downstream. Those IDs, 65, 67, 69, and 71 are not part of that round. It's the collector, the intent edge ID 77, which doesn't change. So my round doesn't fail. Even though I only have 3 edges now rounded, my round didn't change at all. Okay, so it's more robust if I use that intent selection. Okay, so the nice thing about that is I can add geometry to this as well, and my round won't fail. If I take that and I go into my sketch and I add geometry, right, and then I delete the pieces I don't want, my round still gets created. Okay, now I got more edges getting the round. But again, because of all those edges are part of that intent selection. So what I'd like you guys to start doing when you go back to work is look for different selection options, right? If I create a round again, obviously I have this intent selection here, but I have intent selections all over the place. There might be one on this edge. If I go to pick from list, you'll see there's an intent selection that gets that entire face. Okay, same thing with the back. If I pick on my pick from list, you'll see there's an intent selection in the back. So these things are all over the place. And most often, they're a better choice. And they won't fail because they don't belong to geometry. So it's very hard to delete those. Okay.
What if
Now,
I want one of those edges to be different?
Okay, I'll get to that in just a second. Good question. Okay, so if you know what's in the list, right? If I bring up this list, right, as I don't have to go to the list if I know what to expect, right? Because if you notice, I got my cursor over here, and I'm just going to tap my right side mouse button, and you'll see that it's going through the list. Okay, now this little information window that appears is a very important piece of information because it's going to tell me what I'm picking. So rather than going to the list, if I put my cursor over this edge and just tap my right side mouse button, it goes to the next thing in the list. You see that? And as long as I wait for that little message window to appear, I know what I'm going to be picking. And then that round gets created. Middle mouse button is finishing the round. So I can actually get very fast at creating these rounds, right? So I'm going to do it one more time, create the round, put my cursor there, tap right, pick middle, and all those rounds get created. Not only is it faster, but it's more robust. So the moral here is that control key is not always your friend. Sometimes you can't get around it, but look for other options that are more robust. Okay. Now, the question came up, well, what if I want one of those edges to be different? Well, there's certainly several ways I can go about that. I can create the round, right? And get all four of those. And then I can come back in here and say, well, I want to remove that edge, right? Or that round, and I get it that way. That's one way, right? Certainly not the best. If I want a bigger round on here, then I can just say create a round and I can go surface to surface and I got a bigger round, right? So that's as long as it's bigger than the original round, then I'm okay, right? So that's another way to get around that. But the best way, in all honesty, is to create what's called a datum reference feature. And that's this icon right here in the drop down. So what I'm going to do here is let's back up off of that round. I'll create that first. And in this datum reference feature, I have all of these intent chains that I can use. Now, by default, it wants to use this intent chain, but I have intent surface, intent points, and so on. These are all the different options that might be available in that, pick from list. So in this case, I'm just using intent chains, and I'm going to pick that to be used here. And so that shows me in this dialog that that's the intent chain that I want to use. Then I'm going to go to my details here. And under details, we have options to actually remove or exclude from that some edge. And I could pick more if I wanted, right? But I'm going to go ahead and pick that one and say, okay. And then I'm going to create my round. Okay. Now, the nice thing about that is I still have that robustness in the round, and this edge doesn't get it. But if I were to change this feature at all, the round wouldn't fail because I'm still using an intent selection, which is, basically this ID 1078, which is made up of ID 77 and some other stuff, right? So, that's how that's going to work. So I'm creating kind of a hierarchy here. So that's the way we would, if we wanted one to be different or maybe more to be different, that's the way we go about it. Now, to be honest, though, I'm a stickler for organization in my models. If I have a reference that's only being used for one feature and one feature only, I'm going to create it at the time I need that, creating it on the fly, right? So when I do this, I'm going to back up here. I'm going to create the round first. And then I'm going to create my datum reference feature. And I'm going to do this the same way. Resume the round, and there we have it. So now that datum reference is embedded in the round, embedded in the round. I don't see it in my tree anymore. So it's a little bit more organized, right? And that makes it easier for everybody. I'm not trying to hunt somewhere else for where that round's reference comes from. It's right there. I can see it. Okay, so that's the better way to go about that. And typically these datum reference features are only going to be used by one feature. So we would create that when we need it. But you can practice by creating it from the dropdown, right? It doesn't really make any difference in its creation, but it's how we organize our tree. Okay. Now, the nice thing about this is if I edit the definition of this feature, and I'll create a line here, and this time I'm just going to go from midpoint to midpoint and then delete the pieces I don't want and say, okay, these two edges are now new sharp edges in this extrusion. So they will get around on them, right? Because they fall into that collector ID 77. But my round doesn't fail, even though my datum reference feature might have an issue, the round itself doesn't fail. So if I look at that datum reference feature, we can see, yeah, there's something missing there, but we told it to be excluded anyway, so it doesn't fail, right? We already told it that that edge gets excluded. Under details, we see options, and you'll notice here, then it's just highlighted in yellow, right? It's really just a warning saying, hey, you got an issue with this. You might want to fix it. It's not causing any problems downstream. If it were, it'd be red. But in this case, it's not causing any problems. I can certainly remove that and then pick another edge that maybe I want to exclude, right? Or maybe just remove it altogether, right? But I have those choices. So this is where I get that even more capability built into these features. So I'm not sure who was that asked that question, but does that answer your question?
Yes, it gives me a solution.
Okay, right. So again, you can select one or more edges to be excluded. You can even create that datum reference feature to have multiple chains in it, right? I can create this datum reference feature.
I had a question about that. When you selected the intent edge, like for the side edges, it picks all the side edges versus the face edges when you did an intent edge on one of the faces.
Right.
What's the difference and how does it know to like which edges to combine into an intent edge? Does it depend on how you created the initial feature? Right,
because I'm still using the intent selection that's built in, right? So in this case, I probably have three, there might be more, but there's three intent selections, right? There's one there in the back, right? That's ID 76. There's one in the front, which is ID 75. And then there's this one, which was ID 77.
I guess my question is, how is it determining those exist?
Because those are sharp edges created in that extrusion, right? So if I had extruded around on that corner, there wouldn't be any edge to pick there, right? So if I do this, and let's say I create a fillet here, right? Now there's no edge there, right? So when my intent selection is only well, it gets those, but they don't get around on them because they're already tangent, right? So if I wanted to do something else, they would be there. But in this case, I don't think the round. Let's see here. That's what we get. That's a good question. Yeah, it doesn't like that one. So now I'd have to build my own intent selection. That's a good question. You know, I got to say that I learned from people asking questions, right? And in doing that, I incorporate that into my features, right? So this one, it still doesn't want to do that because of those edges. So in this case, your order of features would be important, right? Or I'd have to come in here and maybe create my intent selection a little bit better.
Okay.
Good question. Good question. Right. So yeah, it's not going to work in every scenario, right? I mean, in that case, if I did have that round there, this is where I'd probably want to use, my control key, right? And get the ones that I want. So there's really nothing wrong with the control key other than, it takes a little bit longer and it's a little bit less robust, but in some cases you have to use it, right? So.
Sean, I got a question.
Yes.
This is great for creating rounds, and I understand the intent with referencing edges and whatnot.
Right.
Is it as applicable to where you're creating a feature where you have to sketch and you would be using use edge or project and you get the same power of referenced edges through while in sketch, creating a protrusion or something?
Right. So you have to look for those intent selections. They're going to be different, and it's going to be dependent on what feature you're creating as well, right? So if I say create a sweep, right, and I got that edge there, what other choices do I have? Well, if I hold my shift key down, I can get that whole loop of edges. That's an intent selection, right? If that makes sense. So it's going to vary from feature to feature. And that's why I say when you're using this, look for what's available to you. Now, with a sweep, I don't have much in that list other than the edge. Well, I guess in this case there is an intent. Sometimes you'll find that there's no intent selection there for the sweep, and you have to use your shift key to get there, right? So, I mean, an example might be, well, what if I use that edge, and if I use my shift key, what do I get here? I get that. Now, that is not a default intent selection. That certainly is one that I have to kind of force using my shift key, right? So it's all, again, it's going to vary from feature to feature of how you have to select. Sometimes you can use the pick from list and get what you want. Other times you have to hold down the shift key and pick somewhere else to get a different intent selection, right? So what's nice about this is if I were to change that surface, not likely, but that would not fail in the sweep. In the sketch, Creo 9, they added some really neat things in the sketch. For example, if I were to extrude off of that surface, and in the sketch, I'm going to offset. There's a different menu now for offset. And we have to go to this little rule-based thing. And I'm going to say, give me a complete loop and pick that surface there, or that edge, right? So this is using two IDs. It's not an intent selection. It's using a loop, right, which is a surface. So that's a little bit different in what we had before, right? Now, project gives you even another set of options, but that's kind of how that works. So we get a little bit different in how Creo 9 works. I don't know if any of you are on Creo 9, but one of the important things to note is that you do have to use this little checkbox when you're done selecting, right, to create that. So there are these intent selection tools all over the place. You just got to look for them. And I guess the thing I'm trying to say is that's the most important part, is look for things that might make it more robust for your model, right? And it's usually an easier pick, right? Because I'm not using that control key. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. I'm not using 9 or 10. I didn't know that use edge or project puts up a different menu, but I see where they still kept the loop command. So thank you.
Right, it's still there. I think with the offset, it actually has an option to use all curves in a sketch, right? So if I do that one more time, we'll say extrude on there, offset, and we'll go to that list and rules. Oh, not in this case, but you'll give you a different list in some situations, right? So if you get into Creo 9, look there on this options to see what you can get. Now, I think you can get there from right clicking. You see that I just tap my right mouse button and I got that intent selection. So I can do it that way as well, right? But just remember, there's this extra check mark that we have to press.
How well is that received? Do Pro E users like that new feature?
I do. I didn't like it at first, to be honest, but now that I've used it, I like it. So
okay,
I imagine some of the hardcore users that fought the intent selection or the intent manager in the sketch back in 2001. Those will be the guys that still have problems with it, right? So I remember I was teaching for PTC back then, and I always had to convince those guys that, well, just try it. You can always, back then you could turn it off. Now you can't turn it off, but I just try it. You'll like it, right? So, yeah, I didn't like it at first, but I do now. So, okay, so let's move on to another model here, and now I'm going to go ahead and move to a shaded mode. And I'm going to do this, we're going to do more intent selection, but we're going to create rounds. And again, these intent selections work for other features, but it's easy to show it with rounds. But just keep in mind, if you're doing a sweep or a chamfer or whatever the feature might be, look for intent selection, because that could give you, what you need to create the feature, right? So just keep that in mind. Okay, it might not always be there, but you got to look for it. So I'm going to create a round, and in this case, I'm going to change my value. Now, keep in mind, when you create a round, it always remembers the last value that you used. There's a drop-down list that includes all the values that you've used in the session, right? In this case, I'm going to change it first, and it's always a good idea before you pick on anything is to check your radius value, make sure it's not something that's too big. Otherwise, you're going to sit there and watch it spin. Right now, I'm going to put it on this edge right here. Okay, now that works really good. I've only got one ID, 227. And by the way, remember that ID, 227, right? Belongs to that curved edge. And it's able to create the round on all four of those edges. Why is it able to do that? Can anybody answer that?
Because they're tangent.
Exactly. This caused their tangent. And we can prove that by going to our rules for the round, and tangent is the default rule. So even though we don't bring up this dialog, it's still using the rule, right? So the tangency makes that work. All right. So we're able to do that, and that's fine. That round gets created. We only have one ID, so it's pretty robust. However, it might not always do what I want it to do. So this extrusion here, I'm going to edit its definition. I'm going to edit the sketch. I'm going to create this new geometry first, right? And then I'm going to delete this entity here. Now I'm going to get that warning because this arc ID 32, remember that also, 32 is used downstream, right? I don't want to delete that, right? So that's arc 32, that's arc 30 or line 33. Now, watch what I'm going to do here. I created my new geometry, and rather than deleting this, I want to remap my IDs. Oh, now that's arc 25, that's one, and that's 28, 25 and 28, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick on this 25, and I'm going to replace it with 28. It's giving me a warning saying that the the dimension scheme can't be recreated, so I'm fine with that. But watch what happens there now. That line is now ID 25. A moment ago, it was ID 28, right? So I just remapped the ID from 25 to now be what used to be 28. Okay, so what I've just done is I've made it so that that round doesn't fail. Okay, that round is still using ID 227. Okay, even though it's a different entity, I was able to remap the ID. Creo won't do that by itself. Just keep that in mind. I have to tell it to do that. All right, but the problem with this is my round doesn't go all the way around the bottom anymore. I wanted the round all the way around that feature. So therein lies the issue here. Although it works pretty good as long as I'm not going to remove any tangencies, if I do make those changes, then I have problems, right? So what I really want to do here is I'm going to use an intent selection. The intent selection I'm going to use, and I'm going to create that round again, check my radius value. I'm going to put my cursor here, and I'm going to pick from list. And here you'll see that we have the edge, of course, the surfaces that were behind my cursor, but then we have this intent selection here, okay, and its ID is 240, and then we have this intent selection here, its ID is 239. They look the same, don't they? It looks like the same geometry is being selected. Why would there be two? Well, the reason there's two is because there's two different behaviors for these intent selections. They look very similar. However, they have different IDs, and they do in fact do different things. One of them says create a round, since I'm creating a round, everywhere this feature extrude 3, feature 10, intersects the part, the whole part. The next one is this feature number 10, extrude 3, intersecting feature 1, number 5, or feature extrude 1, number 5, right? So there's a distinct difference between their behavior, all right? So I'm going to cancel this, cancel the round, and then let's just kind of go through this model real quick. I extruded this feature, then I added this round, which is a different feature now, and then I created this extrusion, and then I created that extrusion, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on another config option that tells me the difference between the two. And this is more important, right? This is more important than the first config option. and that it's really valuable in that, because I don't really need to see the IDs. What does that do for me? It just kind of verifies what I'm telling you, but do I really need to see the IDs? Not after I know how they work, right? But in this case, I'm going to add this one that says provide pick message always. And this is really important because this is going to give me some feedback that I really need. And I'm going to say, turn that to yes and say, okay, and okay. So now what happens here is I'm going to get in my message window down at the bottom. It's going to give me the information that I need. So I'll create the round. I'm going to put my cursor there. I'm going to tap once. And this says intent selection, ID 240. But down in my message window, it's telling me this is feature 10 intersecting the part. And if I right click again, it's telling me the side surfaces of feature 10 intersecting the side surfaces of feature 5. Well, that's the one I'm going to use. So left click and OK. Right? Now, this is very powerful because of its robustness. Now, if you remember, this is my feature 5. I said everywhere this feature 10 intersects feature 5, create the round. Keep in mind, this round is a different feature. So we're going to do a little edit here on this feature. And I'm just going to drag it up and over. I don't know if you knew you could do that during edit. You can just drag geometry. And you'll notice it's creating a round up until about where it can't create it. And then as I get a little bit closer, it's able to create it again. So the round will snap back in there, right? And then over the top, just like that. So it's only failing in a few places. And then, of course, that feature, there is no round where it intersects. But why is it able to create the round right in here? That's a different feature. I said feature to feature.
Tangency?
Tangency, exactly. It's still looking for that rule. It's still trying to satisfy that default rule of tangency. So even though I drag the feature up over here, that edge now comes tangent here, tangent there, and so on, right? So if I didn't have the round, you would see there's a tangent edge there. So it's still following that rule of tangency, all right? So that's great. That's exactly what I want. Now, let's use the other option. I'm going to say round, and I'm going to say feature 10 intersecting the part. I'm checking my message window just to make sure that's what I'm going to get. And then we'll do that same thing where we edit it. And we're going to drag this up. I get the same performance here, but notice I get a round now where it intersects that feature. All right. So feature to part gives me a little bit more than feature to feature, but I have those choices, right? So, you know, that's the beauty of that is I have choices with that intent selection. This is so robust that I can take this feature, edit its definition, edit the sketch, delete everything, and recreate geometry, and my round still gets created. Okay. I can take that feature, edit its definition, change the depth to be symmetric, and pull that out to both sides. And as you'll see, my round gets created on both sides, right? I can even take that feature, edit its definition, and drag off the side. And that round gets created, okay? One more. I can take that feature and make it remove material, and my round still gets created. I might not want it there, but it's there, right? So that is one of the most robust methods of creating a round. Now, if you're making plastic injection molded parts where you kind of got rounds everywhere, that works really great. It might not be the best for machine parts, but it's still an option that you have. If it does satisfy your design intent, that's probably the best way to go with that. All right. So very robust in that it's able to do those kinds of things, right? Any questions here? Okay, so I see a lot of times users creating rounds that they make variable, right? Many of you have done this, and you're trying to create a variable round, right? And you're just going to add radiuses all day. You're going to put them where you want to use them, and this is very cumbersome, right? So although we get close, we don't have all the controls that we might want, right? And what I mean by this is I don't really have any control over how that terminates at the end, whether it's perpendicular or not. There's no option in the round that does that for me. And same thing here. Now, if I used more of a technical shape, such as something like this curve here, where it's going straight, then that works. But I mean, if I drive it, I can't control that. So what I want to do is in this round is I'm rather than using multiple radius values. Can I even delete that one? I don't even think I can delete this now. Let's see here. I'm gonna have to delete the whole round. All right. What I want to do is use another reference to help drive that round. And I'm going to use this edge to do that. So I'll create the round, and I'm going to say through curve is my option and pick that. So I get a little bit better control over the round rather than using variable radius. Is if I set something up in advance that helps me control my radius. Now, this works really good also if I have something that's more technical, such as this curve here, right? I get a lot of control over that round. And to be honest, if I tried to do that with a variable radius round, it'd be next to impossible, right? I'd be working all day trying to create that geometry. But if I create the sketch first, right, as long as that sketch is on that surface and terminates at the ends in this situation, I can create that round and use that edge or that curve to control my radius value. You can even terminate the round at 0 along the curve, and you can't do this any other way. If I create a round here, I've created my curve in advance, and I'll use that curve. I can create some really neat geometry. Right now, you might want to run that by manufacturing first, but if they can make it, then no reason why you shouldn't be able to make it. So, using those references appropriately gives me even more power with rounds. Now, and that was, really the topic for this discussion is how do we use references in Creo to capture our design intent, and what are the methods of selecting those references, right? So very, very powerful for creating rounds. Now we can even use existing geometry on the model, right? If I wanted to create a round right here that's variable, whoops, my value is too large. Look at that. Let's go to 2.5, right? But it was able to create it. I can say go through this edge here, which makes it variable. Now notice that little protrusion is kind of offset there on top of that. So if I say go through this curve and I pick that edge, I get that variable round on the existing geometry, right? So again, use references to your advantage. Don't struggle too much. A lot of times you'll find that Creo can do more and you can work less, right? Not work so hard. I know that's the old cliche, work smarter, not harder, right? So let Creo do the work for us. And then again, up here, we can do the same thing. Maybe I want to create a round on that edge, and I'm going to say through curve, and I'm going to use that curve there. And I get, some organic type geometry. So very powerful tools. Okay. The last thing I want to show with this model is I'm going to back up to right about here. And I want to talk about round transition. A transition is where we have multiple rounds that come together, and how do they transition from one to the other, right? So if I create a round here, and then I stop that, and I create other rounds, I don't have a lot of control over what's happening here, right? So to give me that control, what I want to do is create all of those rounds in one feature. And I'm going to say, give me a new set, and I'm going to pick on that edge, and we can give it a different value even. And then I can say new set again. And I could use intent selection to select this stuff, but I'm just trying to make the example here that I'm going to create different round values, but in the same feature. Now, when I do that, I have the option to go to transitions. When I switch to transitions mode, you'll notice that all the transitions are highlighted in this round. So we have certainly the transition right here. We also have transitions at the end, and I'll show you how we can use those in a moment. But let's focus on this one. So I'm going to pick that, right? And then I'm going to say, what are my options for the transition? I have the default, of course, but maybe I just want them to intersect each other. Okay, I can't do that any other way, right? I could, but I had to work really hard. I have maybe a corner sphere. Now, a corner sphere, you have to imagine that largest radius value of a sphere kind of tucked up in that corner there, and then the other rounds transition to it. We have some control over where that transition starts, right? We have a little bit of control there, but that's what's going on, okay? We also have the round one only, which looks like that. I think in this situation, that's probably the transition that I would want, right? But then let's take a look at the patch, which basically kind of makes a patch in there, right? So we have those choices. So your transitions can be very useful if you know how to use them. In this case, like I said, I like this round two only, or round one only, I'm sorry. So I'm gonna use that one. But I also want to modify this transition. Now with this, we only have some end conditions, right? Stop case one, stop case two, and stop at reference. I can actually stop that round somewhere along the edge. We'll talk about the stop cases in a moment. But if I say stop at reference, I can actually create a point on that curve where I want that round to stop. Okay. Now keep in mind that that round, that ID there is, for that round is 83, right? But when I create the round, that edge gets a new ID because it really is a new edge. Okay, it's just something that we told Creo to create as a result of the round. All right, so just you're starting to understand now how these IDs work, right? It's all Creo needs to create features is really the IDs and what those IDs are. It doesn't really matter that that's a straight edge or a curved edge or whatever the case may be. It just cares about the ID. If it finds the ID, it'll try to create the round. Okay. Now, another case for transitions is on this edge, if I create a round, and I want you to watch what happens here as I drag this round larger and larger and larger, right? And the moment I get past that edge right there, this edge right here, watch what happens. Boom. I get this anomaly in the round where it's not passing all the way through the model. And the same thing is true down here too. It's not passing through, right? So this is another case for transitions. And before I go there, though, typically what I'll see out there in the industry is that when users come across something like this, they'll just create an extrusion from that surface all the way through the model to remove material and do it that way. But again, they're working too hard when they do that. And a lot of times it's because nobody's really showed them how to use transitions properly, right? So in this case, I'm going to go into my transitions mode. And you'll notice I do have those end transitions, right? And then with these, we have these stop cases. So stop case 2, I have stop case 3. You'll notice they're not any different. So in this situation, I'm going to use the first one. So you kind of got to try them out to see what they do. Depending on the round, they may very well be different. in what their resulting geometry is. So, but in this case, no different. So I'm going to use the first one in the list. And then the same thing true here. I've got multiple choices here, but they do basically the same thing. So I'm going to use the first one, right? And so there, I'm just creating the round. I'm not creating an extrusion. The round is what I want in this situation. And so that works for me. Sometimes you'll see rounds that are following a tangent chain all the way around your model, but for whatever reason, one end is different than the other end, right? And you're not sure what's causing that. To be honest, I don't know what causes that in some cases, but all I do know is that if I go to my transitions, I can pick and choose how I want that round to terminate. So if you ever see that situation where you're expecting it to look something different than it did, go to transitions. You can pick from the list what might be available there. Okay, so any questions here? Okay, good. I hope you guys are finding this valuable. Again, we have a series of these best practice sessions. This is the first in that series, and it really kind of sets the foundation for everything we do in those other 10 sessions. Is understanding really how Creo is using references to create these features. The next thing I want to talk about is in the sketch. When we use open versus closed cross sections, right? So I'm going to create an extrusion on this surface here, and I'm going to reference this edge right here, and then I'm going to create a rectangle that is kind of attached to that edge, and extrude that to some depth. We can change this later, and then we'll accept that. And then I really want that surface to match that profile. So I'll go ahead in here and I'm going to create an extrusion on that surface. And I'm going to reference that surface and that surface. And I'm going to create a triangle that snaps to those references. We're going to extrude it in that direction. And I want to make sure I go past here to do that. All right, so now I got that surface exactly what I want. However, I'm really working too hard and I'm doing some things that I probably could have done better. Can anybody tell me what I could have done better or what I did wrong?
Use the remove command.
I could have used the remove command, sure.
You
Yeah,
could
it's just
copy
a
a
second.
surface. You can copy a surface and then use the surface replace.
I can do that too, right?
Just leave that sketch open.
So somebody's onto it, right? Leave the sketch open, right? So I'm going to kind of backtrack here of what I did wrong, just so everybody understands, and then leave the sketch open is the right answer here. So understanding how Creo uses open cross sections versus closed cross sections is important because you can get more bang for your buck here if you know how Creo uses these open cross sections. Typically, when I create an extrusion with an open cross section, right, Creo wants to tell me that it can only make a surface out of it, right? It can't create that. It wants to create a surface or a thin solid. Those are my choices. So I need to understand really how Creo manages and uses these open cross sections. First of all, the one thing I did wrong with this was my depth option there. That's bogus, right? It worked here, but what happens if I edit this extrusion and I do something like that? Now my feature doesn't go all the way through, right? So my depth option right off the bat is pretty lazy, if you ask me, right? I really should use a different option from this list. Does anybody know what the best option is in this case?
Through all.
Through all. Okay. Now, through all is kind of the fail safe, right? That's where everybody goes through. Yes, it does work, but it causes Creo to work a little bit harder, right? So anybody want to try another one?
Either to reference or through until. I
Reference.
believe.
Next.
Yeah, so they changed that to reference. It used to be to selected or whatever. So yeah, to reference is really the best choice here, right? And if I say to reference, I'm telling it to stop right there at that surface, right? So that's telling Creo to work as least as possible to make this work, right? And that's probably the more robust option for what I want to do in this situation. Now, the nice thing about to reference or to selected, depending on what version of Creo you're using, is that as you're dragging this drag handle around, if you hold your shift key, watch what happens to that icon. It changes, right? And that's telling me it's looking for something to snap to. And I just got to drag it to that surface and let it go. And it's automatically doing the to reference for me. So again, that's the the nice thing about that. So the reason for that is because to reference is really one of your most robust choices here, right? And although through all would have worked, it causes Creo to work a little bit harder because through all says look throughout the entire model's bounding box for anything else that it might intersect and then create the feature. Now, if that's truly what you wanted, then that's what you would do. Maybe there's another one of these protrusions down over here or something that you want to pass through. Yeah, that's what you'd use. Through all would be perfect. Okay, or through until might be another option for that because maybe I got to go through two protrusions. Maybe there's a third protrusion that I don't want to go through, so that'd be through until, right? I'm telling it where to stop, right? So that would work as well. All right, so these choices are pretty important because they are references and they're going to determine how robust your model is. Okay, now what's the other thing I could have done better in this case?
The open sketch.
The open sketch, right? I don't need this piece of geometry or that piece of geometry. They have IDs associated to it. And I already said, fewer IDs equates to fewer failures. So don't create something you don't need, right? As long as I am attached to the model through a reference, right? Creo can create the feature, right? So it's going to use that open cross section accordingly. Now that would not work unless I was coincident to some reference off the model. Okay, so that's fewer IDs, right? But to be honest, I don't need that feature at all because somebody said already what was the best way to do that. And if I delete this feature, I'm going to edit the definition of that feature and I'm just going to leave it open right there. I don't need that. Right? I'm already attached to the model. Boom. I don't need to replace surface. I don't need to do another extrusion. I'm just creating this geometry attached to the model, right? So that's the best of all of everything. Now, the same thing is true on the bottom here. I see this a lot where somebody will create an extrusion and they'll do something like this. They'll say, well, I got to go that much further into the model because I'm creating this extrusion and I don't want to make sure, there's a gap in here, right? Because, if I didn't make it big enough, there'd be a gap in there, right? And I don't want that gap. So again, this is where your open cross section becomes more powerful because I'm going to edit the definition of this. I'm going to edit the section and let's reference this edge. And then we're just going to delete the pieces we don't want here. And then I'm golden, right? I'm going to follow that surface up through the model. Doesn't matter how tall I make it, it's always going to follow that surface. So your open cross sections are very powerful for getting you the exact geometry, capturing your design intent. Because, really my dimension scheme for this, I probably want to dimension from, that edge right there to that, to get that as my dimension scheme. I don't want any dimensions inside the model that I would have gotten if I had done something like that, right? Where I have that interior geometry. I have all of these dimensions in here that are meaningless to me, and I'm certainly not going to use them on my drawing, right? So always be thinking of your design intent, right? What dimensions do I need to show on my drawing? Although we just spoke about model-based definition, drawings are going away, whether you like it or not. We've been talking about that for 40 years. We may very well be another 40 years out, but they are going away, right? They're more and more manufacturing operations, inspection tasks, things like that are all being done from the model now. So that, those 3D annotations that we create in the model, as long as we're able to capture these dimension schemes in our features, then we're way better off. We got our foot one step down that path towards model-based definition. So always be thinking about that as you're creating your features. Okay. Now, the nice thing about that open cross-section thing is, that works also for organic type geometry, right? I have this boundary blend that I'm going to use to solidify here and just get rid of part of this model. Even if I use that organic surface, right, which is a boundary blend, my open cross section will follow that shape, right? So I'm going to just real quickly create this. I'm going to reference that edge right there, and then I'll create some geometry, right? Something like that, and say, okay, boom. You can see that wants to follow that geometry. So, don't be afraid to try things like that. If you do work on, consumer type products where you have more organic kind of geometry than anything else, try using those open cross sections. When in doubt, make it closed, right? When in doubt, make it closed. But if you can get away with, fewer features to get where you want, you're always better off, right? Fewer features, fewer IDs, fewer references, more robust, right? Is it that Papa John's slogan? better ingredients, better pizza, right? So always keep in mind that you are creating a list of instructions to build the model, and Creo is just following the instructions, right? You can actually kind of see the instructions somewhat if you go to tools and model intent and program and show. I mean, this is really the list of instructions that Creo is using to build this model. It's adding a feature. Its ID is 1. It's a datum plane. Its name is right. It's ending the add. The next one, add feature 2. Its ID is 3, and so on and so on. And the bigger the model, of course, the bigger the list of instructions. But you are writing these instructions, okay? As you pick, you are writing these instructions. So the more clear you are, the better off you're going to be, the easier it is for Creo to rebuild these models. It's kind of like giving directions to the gas station. Yeah, go down to the corner, take a right, go to the next light, take another right, go to the next light, take another right, and then one more right, and you'll find the gas station, right? Rather than saying, oh, just is right behind you there, 1 block down. A little bit easier instruction, right? So be clear on what you're telling Creo to do. Okay, now I mentioned earlier, I got about 10 more minutes, which is perfect. I mentioned earlier that when you create a reference, whether it be a datum plane, an axis, a datum reference feature, create it when you need it, right? Because if we create these datums that are only used for one feature, then we got to manage them in the tree. We have to manage them with layers. I mean, nobody likes to go into an assembly that you see a rat's nest of datums, right? And I'm sure you've all seen that in a big assembly. You open it up, you turn on your datum planes, and it's like, oh my God, I can't see anything. So the reason for that is we've just got too many datum planes that are only being used by one feature. So what I mean by that is if I create an extrusion here, I'm going to create it on a datum plane as my sketching plane, but that datum plane doesn't exist yet. So I'm actually going to create that datum plane right now. Okay. But that datum plane actually rotates around an axis that doesn't exist yet. So I've got to create that axis first, right? And oh, that axis actually passes through 2 points that don't exist yet. So I'm going to create those 2 points. And those 2 points reside on a datum plane that doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to create that datum plane. No, I'm not going to go that far. But you could literally do this all day long, creating this cascade of internal references, right? So although I could keep going, this is all that I need. I'm going to create a datum point on this edge, and then I'm going to create another one on that edge. So I've created 2 datum points. That's all that Creo needs for an axis. So the moment I'm done with the datum points, the axis is created, and then my datum plane passes through that axis at an angle to that surface. So there's the datum plane. Now I'm going to resume the feature, right? And I'm just going to create a rectangle here, something like that. And I'm going to remove material, right? Now, this is where my depth option is important again. I want Creo to figure this out for me. I don't want to tell it. Through all would be another option here that I could use, but again, I could be telling it to work harder, and maybe I don't want it to go through everything. To next actually says to Creo, I want you to find out what's the next surface in the path of this extrusion. And there's 2 here, right? But they could actually change if the angle of this feature changes. So I don't want to explicitly select those. I'm going to let Creo figure that out for me. And then the same thing is for side 2, we'll say 2 next. And then that extrusion goes all the way through the model. But again, I'm letting Creo figure that out for me. Now, what's nice about this is because I created those references at the time I needed them, I do not see them when I turn on my datums. I don't see the points. I don't see the axes. I don't see that other datum plane. They are hidden in this extrude feature. Okay, so it does the work for me. I don't have to manage them, and I'm certainly not hunting in my tree for where those references are. They're all nice and concise in here. And not only that, when I go to edit, all of the dimensions for all of those references are available for me to edit, right? And I can just start dragging stuff around. Here's where that through next really comes into play, right? I want to go to next and stop that feature. But all of these dimensions are available for me to edit in that extrusion, even the size of the extrusion sketch, right? So I got so much more value out of the way I set this up rather than creating all that stuff in advance, one at a time, and then all of that gets shown outside the model. So always look for ways to limit what's in your tree, right? Because I certainly don't want to see a bunch of junk in here that I don't even know what it does sometimes, right? Now, the nice thing also about this, though, is if I do down the road need to use that for something else, I can always drag it out of my tree, right? So if I take that datum and I drag it out of that feature, boom, you'll see all those datums are there, right? And of course, I see them now on my screen, right? So you can imagine if I did that for every feature that I needed some, odd angle, I could have dozens, if not hundreds, of datums. And when I put that in an assembly, I see it all, right? Well, I don't want that. So I'm better off if I just leave that inside that feature and I don't see it in my tree. I don't see it in the view, I'm golden. So with that, that concludes my presentation for today. As I mentioned, we offer this series of best practice sessions. If you're interested in pursuing that, talk to Devin Shearer. He's your account manager, or maybe you have a different account manager for TriStar, but talk to your account manager and inquire about setting that up for your company. Now, we do this first one here. We typically do this at no cost to the customer. You can go back to your office and talk to your managers and say, hey, I saw this really good presentation that might help all of our users. Can we do a lunch and learn? And TriStar is not going to charge me for that, right? So think about it. If you want, like I said, reach out to Devin or your TriStar account manager and set that up. So I have a few more minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions.
If anybody wants Devin's email, I've got that. Seems like this has been really a good presentation. A lot of people joining in. Usually our group is pretty quiet. Does anybody have any questions? We've got about 3 minutes.
If I want to extract the section on Extrude 2 to create a sketch, it is possible?
I'm sorry, if you wanted to create it outside?
Yes. If I on the Extrude 2, I have a section. It's like a sketch. It is possible to extract the sketch from the Extrude 2 to the tree?
No, unfortunately, it won't let me do that. If I wanted to use that section for something else, I would create the section first, right? So I would kind of do it in the same way, but I would say, give me that section. And then I'm going to create my datum plane, right? That's going to pass through an axis. That's going to go through 2 points, right? And then I would create that just a little bit differently, right? So I'm going to create my 2 points, and let's do that on these surfaces here. We'll say that edge and then a new point there, right? I like my axes right there, and my datum plane's at an angle to that. And then I'll say sketch and create that. So now I have the sketch that is got all of those datums internally, right, that you see, but I have that sketch, which I can then extrude and remove material just like I did before, right? So if you like creating your sketches externally, then that's how you would do it, all right?
Okay. And it is possible to add some datum plane on Extrude. You can output your datum if it's create first on the Extrude, but it is possible to add on the other side.
Yeah, sure. I can create a datum plane as my depth, right? So if I wanted to say extrude from here, right, some shape, and then I want that to end at a datum plane, I'm going to say to reference, and then I'm going to create that datum plane right now. Maybe it's through that edge and at an angle, and then we'll rotate that up, right? So I can certainly do that as my reference. So either before or after the feature, right?
Okay.
But still, in doing that, that datum plane gets embedded into the feature.
But if the datum is outside of the feature, can it possible to embed it in the feature?
Yes, if I had created it first and then I create the feature, as long as no other features are using it, then I can do that, right? So if I say, give me a datum plane here, whoops, let's cancel that. Give me a datum plane through that edge at an angle here, right? I've got that, something like that. And then I say extrude from that surface, and we'll do a circle. And I'm going to say 2. I'm dragging and holding my shift key. Boom, there it is, right? As long as there's nothing else using that datum plane, I can drag it inside.
Okay, good, perfect.
Okay. So you can go back and clean up all your models if you want.
Great, great course. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Good job, Sean.
Yeah, it's great, Sean. You and
Thank you.
Thiago are superstars, presenters. We really appreciate. So if this recording works, I'll send you guys the YouTube version and I'll post it. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a good weekend. And Sean, sorry about the typo.
Oh, no worries.
I feel
Thank
bad.
you.
I think I was thinking of Schwan Foods or something.
Yeah, Schwan's Pizza.
Yeah, I know, it's good stuff. Okay, thank you.
All right, everybody, have a great weekend. Thank you.
Bye.